Okay, guys, buckle your seatbelts. This is going to be a wild one. We're going to talk about round robins in sampling, and specifically random recall round robins. You may be wondering what the heck I'm talking about. Well, pour yourself a stiff cup of black coffee and settle in for an engaging discussion on randomizing numbers. So, random recall. It gives you the sound of randomized round robin samples, but with the consistency of cycle round robins. Why? Well, let's look at the way that round robins are normally done. The most standard thing is cycle round robins. Here's an example where you have 5 round robin samples available. Okay, so when you play a note, it's going to play them back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then when it gets to the end, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this is good for a consistent playback, but not good for realism because you're going to have a pattern here that's potentially noticeable by the listener depending on the musical material you're playing. The good thing about it is that when you print your stems for your finicky, impossible to please director or ad client or whoever it is, it will always sound the same. When usually when you press stop on the transport in your host, it sets it back to the beginning. So every time you print your stems or your mix, it's going to sound exactly the same. And that's a good thing. And that's my preference. I'm in that situation usually with the finicky ad client. So I like to use cycle round robins, but I'm making a compromise. Now here's random round robins. This is where it's just totally random, okay? It's better for realism because you're not going to get a repeating pattern, but it's not good for consistent playback because the first note is going to be different every single time. And so sometimes people will pick up on that. It's definitely happened to me. Now, this is the very basic example where we're not even checking to see that when we randomize, you could get a machine gun effect because you could get the same sample twice. It's with only 5 to choose from. There's a decent likelihood of that happening. So then people do a slightly better version where when it's randomized, it checks to make sure there's no repeats. So this is as good as it gets for realism, but it's not good for consistent playback because, again, the first note will be different every single time. So is there a way to have the best of both worlds? And the answer is yes. Random recall. So if you're still with me, do you want me to virtually throw some water in your face or something? Let's talk about what random recall is. So random recall is very good for realism and you get perfect consistency of playback every time. So how do we do it? So instead of a 5 cycle position pattern matching the number of samples that we have in our example, I chose an arbitrary big number for the length of the cycle. It's 256 steps in Jazz Anthology Drums. I chose 256 because it sounded like computery. It could have been any number. So we have our cycle positions, 256. I don't show them all here. So then what happens? We add a second layer to the cycle. Okay. This is going to be a layer that stores the ID of which sample is going to be played at each step in the cycle. So then we get out our dice, our virtual dice, and we roll a random number. Say we get sample number 2. So of our 5 samples, sample number 2 is going to be in the first step. Then we roll again, we get sample number 5. We roll again, we get a number 4, and we keep doing this until the whole thing is filled up with completely random things. And of course we make sure there's no duplicates or repeats along the way. And then I stored this permanently in the instrument, this exact frame, this array here. And then when you play the first note, it goes to the first step and sees what sample are we going to play. And it plays sample number 2 in this case. You play your next note. It plays sample number 5, then number 4, and so on. And it goes all the way until it reaches the end. and then it goes back to the beginning. So it's a cycle. It's like cycle round robins, except it's so long that you could never hear it looping. No one could ever tell that it's looping. And then we didn't just do that for one articulation. Every articulation has its own cycle and is advancing at its own rate. And there's different tables depending on, whether an articulation has 3 round robins or 8 round robins or whatever it happens to have. So that's creating even more variation as you combine, your hi-hat with your ride cymbal, to the point where with the extremely long cycle position, everything advancing at its own rate, the likelihood of you ever, playing like with the pattern maker, if you play a loop, you're basically never going to hear the same bar exactly the same ever. It's statistically highly improbable. So that's the idea. And then when you stop the host transport or play the round robin reset key, which is the low A on the keyboard, it resets the positions for all the articulations back to the beginning again. So, and it also resets the resonant repetition sustain level for everything back to 0. So when you play your sequence from the beginning, every single time it's going to be the same, but every single time it's going to sound random. So it's random recall, the sound of random with the consistency of cycle round robins. I hope you're still awake. Whap, 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 wake up. Now go on to the next video. Okay, thanks for watching this, and I'll see you in the next video.